Hi there, folks. Welcome. Upsaladagwe. My name is Neil Silcox. I'm the Faculty Excellence Lead with the Maple League, and I'm really excited to be hosting this session today, Accessibility as Collaborative Practice, with a bunch of incredible thinkers and educators. I'm joining you today from Chibuktuk, which is in Mi'kma'ki, and I'm here as a settler on unceded territory. And I'll invite you, if you'd like to take a moment to share where you're joining us from in the chat, because we have people from all across Turtle Island, I think. I'm really, really excited. This is one of the first sessions that I got to plan for this season, and I knew it was coming at the very end, and I couldn't be more excited about taking us out of the Better Together season and giving us something really great to think on and work on over the break and as we think about the term that is to come. I don't want to take any more time away from this terrific group, so I will pass it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thanks for getting us started. And Katie is going to share some slides for us. Thanks, Katie. So we're so happy to have you here this afternoon where we can share some of the results of a project that we did through the Maple League. So this is our presentation, Accessibility as Collaborative Practice. We're starting with a land acknowledgement, and we want to acknowledge that our universities are built on unceded territory, the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Abenaki people. We also want to acknowledge that, or provide an access acknowledgement to start. And so this is a talk on accessibility. On the bottom of your screen, we want you to know that you have the option to turn captioning on. So that's the CC button in the menu on the bottom. We will also provide a transcript after the presentation if you would like one. So just send a request. You could send it through Neil. If you encounter any technical issues during the presentation, you can contact Neil Silcox. Neil will put his email in the chat. And please, at any point, if you have questions, feel free to ask. You could just start by saying your name and where you're located today, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So I'm Erin Austen, and I'm here in the psychology department at StFX, and I'll ask my colleague Katie Aubrecht to introduce herself.
Okay, hi, thanks Erin, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Katie Aubrecht, and I'm in the sociology department at StFX.
Hi everyone, I'm Jane Dryden, and I'm in the philosophy department at Mount Allison.
Mary Ellen.
Hi everyone, I'm Mary Ellen Donnan. I'm in the sociology department at Bishop's University.
And
Hi everyone. I'm Cynthia Bruce, and I was in the School of Education at Acadia when the project started, and am now in the Department of Creative Arts Therapies at Concordia University in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal.
Great, thanks. So we had a number of people working with us on this project. So we want to acknowledge the work of Tara Martin and Dr. Tammy Berneski. At Acadia, we had Catherine Waterbury, and at Bishop's, Taylor Merrithew, and at Mount Allison, Julia Connolly and Stina Katayama, and at StFX, Bailey McDonald Frizzle, Anola Campbell, and Alexandra Boyd. And we also had some supports from Megan Landry at the StFX library. Neil, if you would, I have a poll just to find out who we have in the room and their interest in accessibility. So I'll ask Neil to launch our first poll. You'll see that on the screen in a moment. So the question is, how would you rate your knowledge of accessibility on campus? High, moderate, low, or no knowledge?
Wait a minute as results filter in.
Okay, so great. It's looking like we have a mix in the room. Many of you have moderate knowledge of accessibility on your campus, some with high knowledge, some with low knowledge, and nobody with no knowledge. So I think we're all interested in accessibility. Neil, I'll ask you to move to the second poll if you could. The second question that we have is, what comes to mind first when you think about accessibility? We have a number of options here: built environment or physical environment, technology, attitudes, teaching and learning environment. Okay, great. So we have, it looks like from the responses that they're spread out across these categories, which is great. I think when we initially talk to people, they tend to focus on the physical or built environment. So it's nice to see that everyone is thinking about some other areas of accessibility as well. Thanks, Neil. I'll ask, so we can close the polls or share the results, I guess, if you, yep. And I'll ask Cynthia to take over the next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Erin. Katie, is the next slide up?
Yes, it is, Cynthia.
Perfect, thank you. So we just want to give you just a little bit of context about the policy and legislative environment we are currently in. So apart from what's happening in our individual provinces, we're largely kind of working under the new Accessible Canada Act, which has, in some respects, a long, convoluted, but important, I think, definition of what accessibility is and what disability is. And so without reading what's on the screen, I want to highlight that disability under the Accessible Canada Act really encompasses a really broad range of impairments, including physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, sensory, or even a functional limitation. And importantly, it highlights that it can be permanent, temporary, or episodic in nature, and visible or invisible, or evident or not. And that these, in interaction with a wide variety of barriers, creates disability because it hinders a person's full participation in society. We also work under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada is a signatory to, which says accessibility is a human right. The CRPD also highlights the right to dignity, non-discrimination, inclusion, respect for difference, equality of opportunity, autonomy, and respect for the evolving capacities of young people. 22% of Canadians report having a disability. So the prevalence is high. The prevalence of disability is highest in Nova Scotia of our 4 provinces, 30.4% in New Brunswick. It's 26.7%, and both higher than in Quebec, where it's 16.1%. Katie, if you can go to the next slide, please, that would be great.
Great, it's up.
So the Canadian Survey on Disabilities from 2017 tells us that mental health related disabilities are the most prevalent among youth, aged 15 to 24. And I think that's really important for us to pay attention to in universities. Another thing that the results and the infographic highlight is that even when people with disabilities go to school, so when they go to post-secondary, we know the outcomes are better. than if they didn't go, but they don't experience still the same benefits as their abled peers do from higher education. So for example, those with formal education, persons are less likely to be employed than their non-disabled peers. So we have lots of work to do here to sort of improve the outcomes, and universities and higher education institutions really can be leaders in this area. Move on to Katie.
Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia. We know, and we knew this prior to going into the study, that students with disabilities face many barriers to education, and these barriers take multiple forms. They are social, and they can, materialize or manifest through bullying, microaggressions, and exclusions. There's also barriers in terms of lack of accommodations and supports, both in the sense of lack of, accessing those supports that exist, and the absence of needed supports and services on many university or post-secondary educational campuses. We also know that there are significant financial barriers to education. So there are financial costs. The way that the system is currently set up, students with disabilities may take longer time to completion or experience interruptions in their academic journeys, and those come with financial consequences. We also know that there are limited course selections, and that this is particularly the case with respect to correspondence or distance courses. And as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of those rationales that these courses just couldn't be offered, they were shown to be not necessarily the case. That people were able to move courses online. So all of these various barriers have a negative impact on a number of factors that include things like the degree choice, degree completion, as well as career options and well-being.
Hi, so this is Jane again. So this presentation results from our Accessibility as a Collective Practice project, which aimed to assess and improve accessibility within the university sector in Eastern Canada by generating evidence about current accessibility policy and practice at the 4 Maple League universities. And we're quite grateful to research funding that was available through the Maple League. That was sort of the beginning of the whole thing, is one grant that got us going, and we're still going. And part of the impetus from the project was from new provincial accessibility legislation in Nova Scotia. I see Jessica Riddell's comment in the chat. Small and mighty grants, indeed. So new provincial legislation in Nova Scotia, but also from the other universities, right, wanting to kind of think about how to up their game. So since the work of standards development is just beginning, it's important to establish and articulate the current state of accessibility on each campus. It's really important to identify what needs to be done to become accessible in all areas, to figure out where we are and where we should be. I'll note that our project also included a portion in which we asked about people's experiences with accessibility during COVID-19 specifically. We're not going to talk about that in the formal portion of the project, but if any of you have questions about that, we can certainly take it up later. And so, of course, the sort of impetus behind this was new legislation. Despite the important role that legislation can play, social and attitudinal changes in how disability is perceived and responded to are also really needed, as we'll get into. So as part of our presentation, we're going to discuss how fostering an accessible, welcoming, and inclusive post-secondary environment for people with disabilities involves more than compliance, like more than kind of rule checking. It involves recognizing disability as an important dimension of diversity and identity in higher education, and a real culture of inclusion. So We have a four-pronged approach. These are the these are the prongs: a review of existing literature, an environmental scan of accessibility policies across the 4 universities, campus-wide online surveys, and then interviews. So I'll touch on this one just really briefly. If you have questions about it, you can of course ask just for time. But one of the components was a review of existing literature pertaining to accessibility in the post-secondary sector over a 10-year span. We really want to thank our student research team for a lot of the work that they did here. So we looked at various search terms, and ultimately less came up than we thought would come up. And a lot of what came up, and a lot wasn't actually available at Maple Leaf universities. The themes of what did come up really emphasized barriers. So to participation, accessing supports, underrepresentation. A lot of the times articles were focused on very specific disabilities or accommodations and adaptations, rather than overarching questions of like culture change or whole system transformation. And one of the things that jumped out to us, you can see in a little footnote at the bottom of the slide, is that some of the sort of top disability journals that might kind of focus a little bit more on that sort of system change were not available at Maple League libraries. So there were some articles that we kind of collectively knew about that didn't show up in the search. And for some reason, very few really got into physical accessibility of post-secondary, even though that's a big issue that comes up in our research, or on legislation. And I see questions in the chat, so we can kind of come back to that later. So over to you, Cynthia.
We might want to be able to just quickly answer that,
Oh, sure.
Jane, and it's why you didn't include UDL as a search term. And I'll just say that our initial, at the outset, we thought that accessible and accessibility would capture everything, including things in the teaching and learning environment like UDL or universal design for learning. And the fact that it didn't tells us that those of us who are writing papers on UDL should be using accessibility as a search term.
Thanks, Erin.
Great, thanks. So I'm now about to make an accessibility request, which I should have done earlier. Neil, in particular, if you could maybe not put links in the chat while I'm speaking, because I'm using a screen reader, so all of a sudden I'm trying to listen to my notes, and then I hear all of the texts pop up, and so it's just a tad distracting, and it's actually always something to keep in mind about accessibility. We're in these online environments where we're sort of using multiple modes of engaging with each other in this sort of meeting room. So that would be fabulous.
Will do, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so just a quick note about the environmental, which is really a policy scan, and we want to thank our Associate Dr. Tammy Bernaski, who did this work for us. She led a scan of accessibility policies in our 3 provincial jurisdictions. So what we learned through this scan, and we knew some of it before we started in on it, Nova Scotia is the only province within the Maple League of Universities that has provincial accessibility legislation that mandates post-secondary accessibility plans, but more broadly will mandate compliance eventually with the education accessibility standards that are currently under development. So those plans are sort of step 1, required of all places that have been designated public sector bodies, and universities are one. New Brunswick's post-secondary institutions have a duty to accommodate students with disabilities through the New Brunswick Human Rights Act. And Matt Allison also has an accessible facilities policy and a policy on students with disabilities. Quebec has the Act to secure handicapped persons in the exercise of their rights with a view to achieving social, school, and workplace integration, a long one. And the Quebec Association for Equity and Inclusion in Post-Secondary Education works to promote accessibility in post-secondary institutions. So the findings from the environmental scan fit with past findings from the National Educational Association of Disabled Students. According to needs, there are strong regional and provincial disparities with respect to institutional and provincial policies and practices around accessibility and inclusion in post-secondary education. One of the things we wanted to note is that each campus does have a support system in place for students and has policy around that. And certainly now will be a really good time to be strengthening those policies and to, in Nova Scotia's case in particular, ensuring they will align with what's required under the legislation. The other thing that we wanted to note is that amongst the 4 institutions, there is little to no pathway for accommodation support for faculty and staff who identify as having disabilities. Mount Allison is working on a policy for accommodating faculty, and it's part of an MOU in its most recent collective agreement. So while we see good policy support for students, there's very little for faculty, and there's almost never a clear path to getting support in place.
Mary Ellen here. I just want to give you a brief introduction to our survey process. So 2 versions of the survey was created, one that was focused towards students and it's slightly tailored differently for faculty, staff, and administration. So an invitation to participate in the survey was circulated via campus listservs, and there was also a snowball sampling process that went along with that, encouraging people to invite others to also fill out our survey. So what we had for responses from faculty, staff, and administration was a total of 119, and that sample included 58% faculty, 30% staff, and 8.4% administrators. Among that population, 14.5% said that they live with a disability. So I think this echoes back very much to what Cynthia was talking about, and the need to pay more attention to faculty, staff, and administrators' accessibility issues. So the survey focused on what is working, what is not working, and what improvements could be made for a more accessible experience of higher education. And we found 6 different themes within the survey data responses. There were some open answer opportunities, and we got lots of interesting material from that. So I'll just go on to the next slide and start talking about the first of those different themes, which was infrastructure. Respondents from all 4 institutions provided extensive evidence and a variety of narratives about infrastructure barriers, although the newer buildings were generally more accessible. But the accommodations which do exist are not always effective. So for example, one faculty member described doors with the electronic assist button, but they wouldn't open during strong winds. I wanted to give you one particular quote from a faculty member to end my little portion. That person said, due to the nature of when the majority of buildings were built, accessibility is possible, but not convenient, obvious, or easy to navigate. With current construction projects in place, along with COVID flow requirements, the campus has become less accessible, and it will be very hard to support those with accessibility needs, end quote.
So the second theme that we identified in the surveys was flexibility around teaching and learning. And a number of respondents said that there was a lack of flexibility in course design and assessment. So most people, when they think about assessments or when faculty assign assessments, they're mostly restricted to exams and papers. And so students were saying this doesn't, and faculty were saying it doesn't fit all students, best modes of expression. So we need to be expanding our view of assessment. Many of our classes also require attendance, and I think particularly during we're still living in a pandemic. Some students, especially those with disability, this requirement affects them disproportionately to other people. And then some of our respondents also talked about a restriction on learning aids. And two of the examples that stand out for me are a student who had dyslexia and said that they were on their exams and assignments, they were losing points because of spelling errors. And another student who said that they needed a calculator and couldn't bring in a calculator to an exam. Our respondents also talked about lack of supports and accommodations, and Katie touched on this when she spoke. So I'll just read this quote from a faculty member. There's also a challenge with professors who feel that accessibility standards and providing accessible education is an infringement on academic freedom. There's a serious lack of understanding of human rights and freedoms. And in general, a theme that kept coming up, or a topic that kept coming up, was a lack of understanding about disabilities. So we take this as saying that we need more professional development and training around accessibility. We need to increase mentoring for new faculty so that they are aware of other modes of assessment. And we need to increase their focus on universal design for learning, or UDL. The third theme to come up in the surveys was supports. There was a recognition that our disability support offices and accessible learning supports are very helpful, but they do require that those who use them have appropriate documentation. And this posed a problem for some users, or would be users. And then it was also noted that they were understaffed. So one faculty member said, the accessible learning department does a great job with the students they serve. However, they are understaffed relative to significant increases in demand. It also came up, and this may be because we are living during the pandemic, but it was difficult to access health and counseling services. And there was a note, and this was from part-time faculty in particular, that there was a lack of health benefits and sick days. And so we have to consider that, especially at a time like this. The fourth theme was attitudes and awareness. And one faculty member said it quite succinctly: culture change is needed. Accessibility is not even imagined in diversity and inclusion initiatives. It is treated as a medical problem. Students and faculty with disabilities are not treated as the experts of disability. Professional staff and faculty without disabilities are. And so in thinking about how we might act on some of these comments and views, is trying to consider less medicalized and proof-based supports. And this would help to capture those students and faculty who are dealing with episodic disability. So I'm thinking in particular of people who have concussions, or people who break an arm or a leg. How do we support those people and consider their accessibility outside of these our accessibility centers? And then a general increase in awareness around accessibility. Fifth, there was little sharing of information, and this came up repeatedly, little sharing of information across organizational units. So it seems that everybody is doing a little bit on accessibility, but we're all working independently and not consulting disability and accessibility experts. One faculty member said there's no consistent systemic plan. It's mostly reactive, and as with everything, hugely financially constrained. Very little sharing of information between units. If all accessible decisions are afterthoughts or add-ons and poorly planned, then it reinforces the discourse of special, extra, and expensive around our commitments to inclusion, diversity, and equity. The sixth theme that came up is this need to expand our definition of accessibility and include things beyond physical accessibility. And that's not to say that we're undervaluing the importance of physical accessibility. It's just seeing things beyond physical accessibility that we need to address. There was recognition in the survey that some units are doing that well. So libraries, for example, are making efforts towards offering accessible services for everyone by providing guidelines and instructional documents on accessibility as one example. One faculty member said efforts to update and stay current around physical accessibility. There are efforts to update and stay current around physical accessibility. However, there's very little being done for the larger inclusive accessible efforts in curriculum, instruction, and digital practices. So when we're thinking about our strategic plans around accessibility, we need to be broadly thinking about accessibility and include the teaching and learning environment, include communication, technology, et cetera. And then in general, we have to improve communication across our units. And so that we're really working together to make our campuses accessible.
Hi, I see in the chat that there's a question about where the results are housed. So just to quickly respond to that, we're in the process of developing a website, which is not up yet, but stay tuned. I think we'll have a reminder about that at the end. So the fourth prong of our research involved interviews. The recruitment strategy involved identifying some sort of pre-identified stakeholders who we thought would be likely to have useful things to say, but also anyone who participated in the survey was asked whether they would be interested in being contacted for an interview. So we also got some participants through that way. We had 42 interviews in total. Which is lots. So 15 from StFX, 12 from Acadia, 9 from Bishops, and 9 from Mount A. And we asked a range of questions, but some of the key ones we asked were things like, how do you define accessibility or inaccessibility? What does it mean to you? And like, what's at stake if accessibility is not improved? So some key insights. One of the really big things was just involving it being like an outcome of really meaningful relationships and collaboration. And similarly, that there's a concern with sort of the idea of doing just enough, and that was connected with inaccessibility. So, kind of at face value, accessibility in post-secondary institutions might appear to be merely an issue of accommodation. But the interviews with faculty and staff and students really highlighted that accessibility, it's really important to think of it as not just being about sort of mere compliance, not being about just merely doing enough, and also that accessibility or inaccessibility involves understanding why it really matters and why it's really important at an institutional level. Despite all the legislation involved, despite all the legislation involved highlighting accessibility from a human rights perspective, disability tends not to be viewed in this way. It tends not to be viewed as that kind of priority, right? It's a human right, so it's a real priority. And so to kind of get more accessibility is not just sort of like box ticking, but real collaboration, real communication, and not just doing enough. Next slide. In terms of accessibility, if accessibility is not improved, this was a really great question from the interviews. So I'll just share these quotes from the screen, which I think are quite apt. So one faculty member said, in terms of what's at stake, 1, we're not going to get students coming here, and 2, we're going to end up with lawsuits. So it really is a distinct priority. And then one student said, if accessibility is not improved, I honestly think the university is going to fizzle out. Our generation and the generations coming up behind us are really big on equity and fighting to make a just world. And I think that the institutions that don't listen to that pushback from young people are going to be the ones that fizzle out and die, because no one's going to want to support an institution that doesn't promote a future that we want to see. And I think that is both that should be a rallying cry, right, for all of us.
Okay, so thank you so much, Jane. Another thing that had come up in the interviews quite prominently was attitudinal barriers. Accessibility was viewed as a student problem and not really an issue for faculty and staff. And this has consequences both for, placing the onus of responsibility for addressing those barriers and removing them with the students, but also making it difficult or challenging to perceive those barriers for faculty and staff, as well as for visitors. And we heard quite a bit about the importance of taking things like events that are on campus or off campus into consideration as part of accessibility plans. We heard, as Erin talked about rigid pedagogies, perspectives, and teaching styles. We also heard, as Erin mentioned, about that lack of understanding about disability and accommodation. So these things that had come up through the surveys, people went into greater depth about them in the interviews. Importantly, we also heard about a lack of understanding of trauma and, a really kind of surprising reluctance to imagine some of the challenges that people were facing from a trauma-informed perspective. And so I think that there's insight there related to, what are some of the approaches that we have to consider as we're working to make campuses and university and college communities more accessible. There was the medicalization of disability and the request of some kind of documentation for accommodation. Accommodation was, again, framed as a privilege rather than a right. Whenever accessibility would come up for recreational services or campus events, as I said, it was perceived as something extra, a bonus or a luxury. We also heard that there was a real lack of advocacy and advocates on post-secondary campuses. Now, that said, the champions that existed were powerful, again, right? Like the mighty, but it's put a lot of pressure might be on a few people. And not only is that not fair to individuals, it doesn't address those systemic issues. We need to kind of be thinking a bit more broadly about how to support that systemic change. So we need to shift from compliance agendas, which actually may result in what one participant referred to as an almost triage system, where certain barriers or certain populations of students, primarily again students, but we could think of the university population, may be prioritized because of a sense of that this is an issue that is recognized, whereas others may fall through the cracks. And so if we adopt a really broad definition of disability, we really need to go the distance. We need to think about not only whether and how advocacy is playing out on campuses, but also how engaging in accessibility advocacy work involves some kind of reconciliation, where you're reconciling the routine deprioritization of disability and disenfranchisement of disabled people in and by institutional agendas. So we heard from those people that are the champions very often that it can be difficult to do this work and not see a lot of progress. So we need to also be able to support our advocates, and that this involves pushing back against university accessibility policy that fails to adopt a human rights perspective. or that adopts it, but operationalizes it, so puts it into practice, implements it in programs, services, and practices in terms of some kind of risk management, and where individuals might be, really constructed as risks. We also need to push back against disability materializing, so becoming apparent in policy and policy talk as only an accommodation issue, which can be very individualizing. So accommodations are key, but accessibility and disability are not, they're not reducible to accommodation, and yet sometimes that can happen when within programs and policies and services. So where accommodation involves implementing institutional processes of risk management and practices that are driven primarily by professional expertise, and that's not suggesting that there shouldn't be professional expertise, but that it shouldn't be the sole driver in disability and accessibility policy and policy discourse on campuses. We also need to push back against accessibility knowledge at Maple League universities that centers expert perspectives, whether they're health, educational, or otherwise, and treats people with lived experience as objects of expert knowledge and institutional regimes rather than experts themselves. And to be thinking about those processes of engagement and ensure that we're, being mindful of the possibility of tokenism, where a few individuals might be engaged and asked to speak on behalf of whole communities. We need to have really informed, meaningful engagement that, again, goes the distance. So we need to also be thinking from, an intersectional perspective, and thinking about what accessibility and those barriers that accessibility speaks to, what they look like for diversely located people and communities. So we heard from several of our participants that there's a real issue with what one interview participant referred to as racial profiling and disability. And so this works in at least two ways. Where racially visible students, people who are racialized, may be either assumed that there's some kind of other issue at play, but not having disability explored. So there may not be the same kinds of supports and services to recognize a disability impairment or difference when it's present, and thus be able to really help the student in having the best possible experience. Or students may be streamlined in certain directions and labeled in ways that may not actually accurately reflect, again, their own situations and learning styles. So this is a key issue. And how can we think about the intersections between, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous and racism and anti-racist approaches and strategies within universities, and how does an accessibility and disability. We also heard that that international students face significant barriers, and that this is a real critical issue. And so here's a quote from one student. There's an international student with epilepsy who is a colleague of theirs or a peer, and they said, this person will warn professors that they have epilepsy and say, I might have a seizure in class. It's fine. You don't have to call the ambulance. But then every time this student had a seizure, the class in the class, the prof would call the ambulance, which costs money, which becomes a financial issue because this person is an international student. We also heard about Indigenous services and supports, and how, you know, we really, if we were going to take a kind of intergenerational approach and support families and communities and elders and being on campus, we need to think about how to organize the space and to be able to support that. And then with gender, it's really, you know, adopting a gendered approach where if we're looking at mental health disabilities, we're thinking about access to counseling and medication if needed, but also a trauma-informed approach that recognizes gender-based violence. And so if we want to really promote the futures that we say we want, we need to address inequities and underrepresentation of disability perspectives. We really need to focus less on just workshops, so continue to offer things like webinars like this, but go even further. And we have to really, you know, not infantilize or be paternalistic towards people with lived experience in ways that objectify them. There needs to be meaningful engagement. And so now I'll switch over to Cynthia.
Thanks, Katie. All right, so what does all this mean in everybody's real day-to-day work lives? Where can we start? We know that sometimes it can seem overwhelming to think about how we become accessible institutions, and particularly in Nova Scotia, where we have a government mandate that says we will become accessible by 2030. So what can we do differently now that we have this information as a sort of a collective of universities? We know from our own experience that lots of people sort of ask us for checklists of things that they can do to make campus more accessible. Just tell me what to do and we'll fix it. But achieving accessibility really requires efforts greater than adhering to a checklist. It requires flexible and relational approaches and an understanding of the diversity of experiences and needs of individuals and groups within university communities. And it needs to be informed by the knowledges and perspectives of those individuals and communities. So some concrete examples, and these really are starting points that we're offering from our collective experience, and also I think from the data, the things that we heard from our participants. And they sometimes seem like small actions to improve accessibility, but they're meaningful in lots of ways. So Kate, if you want to go to the next slide, please.
Okay, it's posted.
So there are lots of examples, but we'll focus on a few here to beginning. So when we think about accessible classrooms, or what it means to be accessible in our classrooms, which encompasses physical access as well as sort of the accessibility of our content and our way of being and teaching. One of the things that we highly recommend is using the Accessible Syllabus Project when you're designing your syllabi, so that it makes a really clear, accessible document for all kinds of people who are going to engage with it. And we'll provide some links to these resources at the end so that you know. I find it a really useful way to develop my syllabus to ensure that that information is accessible to people. Also include a commitment to accessibility at the top of your syllabus. So I know lots of times we will include sort of a standard accessibility statement sort of at the end of our syllabi that's under the sort of lists of services available to students. But I highly recommend moving it up to the top. So I do this, I put it right at the top of my syllabus and situate it so that it's about a commitment that I make, not just a statement that I'm making to refer people to a set of services that are available. And I sort of work with students to co-develop a collective commitment to accessibility so that they understand what accessibility means in my class. So I've rewritten what is the standard statement so that I can say to students that, you know, I strongly believe it's my job to teach them all, and that I believe strongly in engaging with them as their instructors so that I can understand who they are as learners and how I can best provide support to all of them and not just those who quote unquote have a individual need that we might frame as a special need and in need of an accommodation. So I talk about, you know, communication and flexibility and my commitment to be responsive and flexible to them. And then I follow up with them and make sure that they know I'm accessible and available to them. And that makes a really substantial difference for students. Ensure your course materials are accessible. So think about all the digital documents that you're creating and whether they're accessible to a diverse group of users, and particularly those who are screen reader users who need accessible formats. And specifically think about ensuring your PDF documents are accessible. Think about providing readings and materials in advance so that students have access to them before they get into the classroom. And also then think about multiple ways for students to engage in and demonstrate learning. So thinking about, you know, incorporating UDL principles and practices into your course design. So secondly, thinking about space, just accessible spaces on campus. In your classrooms, really important to just check for obstacles. Just do a quick scan when you go in to check for obstacles. Are there signs or garbage cans in the way? I can't even tell you how many garbage cans or wet floor signs I've tripped over on my way into a classroom. You know, remove the signage that blocks the accessible door button. Make sure that when you go in, and I'm thinking about my experiences at Acadia, when you go into a room that's full of wheelie chairs, that they're not all scattered everywhere and really blocking people's access. Make sure it's just a clear path. The quick things to do when we walk in. Okay, Katie, I think going on to the next slide.
Great, it's up.
So think about communication. So invite and maintain connection with your students. I know that feels overwhelming when you have a lot of students, but it's really critical to just have them know that you're approachable. Advocacy, I think, is an interesting one that we need to think about, because we often think about we need to advocate for students. I would say we need to advocate for equity, and we need to advocate for the intentional inclusion of accessibility in all our equity and diversity considerations. And then we need to advocate with students in ways that are hopefully empowering, but not placing the responsibility on students themselves to essentially create their own access. So it's about showing up and speaking up when we need to, and not just leaving that to the people whose jobs are defined by the word accessibility. Consider disability broadly. So this isn't just about what we do in classrooms and how we create syllabi, but it's about how we organize our meetings on campus, our committee meetings, our community meetings on campus. So we need to ensure that if we're sending or bringing materials to meetings, we just don't bring a stack of paper and hand them out, but we have accessible formats available and we send them out in advance so people can look at them in advance. We need to offer online access so that we are attentive to the ways that people can and can't attend meetings. Optional captioning and transcription, and we have lots of automated programs that do that now, including Otter AI. And we need to think about accessible locations, including ones with accessible washrooms and barrier-free spaces. And I think finally, with technology and virtual meeting software, we need to think about accessibility when we're sharing resources, when we're using online sort of repositories of documents. if you're not sure if they're accessible, find out. There's lots of ways to find out without asking all of the already overburdened disabled folks on campus whether things are accessible or not. So we just need to take responsibility and initiative to find out if things are accessible. And if they're not, then don't use them, because there are lots of platforms that are accessible. And I guess last and most importantly, collaborate and be creative. I think it's what we do well. There was a comment that popped up from Lynn Aylward, who is often my collaborator in all things accessibility, to say, let's create a group to get rid of timed exams. I think there's all kinds of things that we can do as creative working groups. We have really benefited from that as a research group. Coming together has really allowed us to be creative and think creatively. Thanks, Katie.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia. And so here I just have a list of some resources that you can check out. So the first and foremost, National Association of Disabled Students or NEEDS is such a resource that we have in Canada. And so their website is up there, www.needs.ca. They offer bursaries, guides, webinars. Excellent, check them out. And then there's just a series of other different examples of tools that you can access. Everything from the Accessible Syllabus Project to the National Standard of Canada for Mental Health and Wellbeing Post-Secondary Students, information to how do you plan an accessible event or a meeting, and also, you know, thinking about what are those other resources that you might need to connect with in order to ensure your event is accessible? So captioning or CART, and which services have a reputation for, you know, offering quality services. So we'll have these up there, and thank you so much for your time today. And if you're interested in learning more about the project, you can follow us on Twitter at Collab4Access, or Instagram Collab4Access, or send us an email at carelab@stfx.ca. And as colleagues have noted, we do have a website under development where we'll be sharing more results from the study. Thanks.
Thank you so much, folks. We have maybe just 1 minute for a quick question if anyone had anything really pressing. I'll also say some folks have had trouble accessing the slides from the chat. If you want to stick around afterwards, I will make sure that I grab your email address and I'll send it to you, or you can send me a private message. Would anyone like to turn their camera on and speak a question, or type a question into the chat and I can read it out? Dr. Roberts, hi.
Hi. Tony's good. I just wanted to say thank you all very much. I don't really have a question. It's more of a comment. Thank you so much for doing this research, for helping all of us sort of move forward with accessibility. It's incredibly important. And I love the quote from the student who said, you know, if we don't start addressing this, we're going to lose people. We're not going to have the kind of inclusionary society that we want. And as you know, a sociologist, that's really important. So thank you all so much for this great research and important research. And I applaud you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tony. And thanks everyone for sticking around. We know we put it right to the last second. That was not our intention, but we knew we were long today, but thank you.
Every second was worth it. Thank you so much to all of you for presenting. Thank you to everyone for joining us.